guys, so this is the last video lecture in Unit 1 on Socratic methods. We are ending this unit and we are going to be doing our first oral exam in the course coming up next week. So if you haven't gotten a time reserved for your oral exam, you'll want to do that now. If you have any trouble doing that, just reach out to your instructor before next week to make sure that you've got a place reserved so you meet that course requirement. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about Socratic dialogue, and this is something we've mentioned before in the course. Right at the outset of the course, we talked very briefly about a type of multi-step conversation you can have about controversial ideas. And we kind of just heard generally that it involves listening carefully to other people and making sure that you can restate their view accurately before you begin trying to ask questions or make challenges to what they're saying. And it also allows people the space to step back and adjust their view in light of criticism and make it better. So it's an interesting strategy, and we're going to look a little bit more at what the steps are in the Socratic dialogue in the session, just because we're going to want to do that kind of dialoguing in our discussion posts for this course. So the things that we've covered so far in Unit 1 are going to help you engage in this type of dialogue. They provide the method of engagement in each step. So in Unit 1, we've learned how to give arguments and how to evaluate them for validity and soundness. If this were more of a logic class, we would talk about arguments that go beyond deductive arguments, and we would talk about different types of logic. But for purposes of this course, the basic structures that you've got kind of give you a good sense of what an argument looks like, what it means for an argument to be valid rather than sound, and why we want to look for validity first. And then, as long as it's valid, then we have reason to start arguing about the truth of the premises. Because if an argument's invalid, we don't have to take the argument seriously at all, because even if everything that the person said is true in the premises, it could still be that the conclusion is false. So we want to make sure that when we're engaging in Socratic dialogue, that we're making sure that the arguments are formed well, and then we can figure out, well, which of the premises are most likely to be false, and then focus our attention there. Okay. We've also learned some other basic concepts, like how to define our terms, make sure that we're using our language carefully and clearly. We've learned some diagram types that allow us to express kind of complicated claims in very clear diagrammatic ways, and that's going to be useful to you as we develop our thoughts on what it is to have a certain gender, what it is to have a certain sex. These tools will come in handy. Also, this last couple sessions, we've been talking about some informal fallacies that are pretty common, and so something like the straw man fallacy you'll want to keep in mind. It's a very common one that you'll see out there in the wild. And it's not just that you want to be able to tell somebody that, hey, look, you're not listening to me, you're straw manning my position, you're taking this version of the argument or the version of the position that I've staked out and making it the worst possible version, so it's easier for you to criticize it, right? And in this critical refining, Socratic questioning step, and that is a very good thing to know about, is to be able to put a name on what somebody's doing to you if they're not listening and restating your view correctly. The dialogue won't be very useful. But it's also kind of a reminder to you that you don't want to do this to someone else. So you really do have to listen carefully. And even when it's a view that you don't like, you have to make sure that you're listening carefully to what the person's really committed to, and then restate it in a way that you would expect your interlocutor to agree with your characterization of their view. And once you do that, you're ready to move on to actually engaging in some disagreement, because now your disagreement is going to be with the view that they actually hold. So some of these skills are a little softer, like figuring out these informal fallacies, where some of them are very concrete and objective. It makes it a little easier to learn things like deductive arguments and Venn diagrams than it is to maybe pick up on strawman fallacies or equivocation fallacies, if these things are new to you. But hopefully with a little practice, these are things that you'll be able to apply in real conversations. Okay, so when you do apply these things in a context where everyone else is abiding by the same rules and trying to apply the same methods and has the same goals, right, where you're trying to use the language that allows you to express yourself most clearly and accurately, and where you're guided by logic and avoiding rhetorical tricks that could maybe be persuasive, but it would be type of manipulation or type of deceit to use them, because you know that it might lead someone to astray, that these are not good rhetorical tools. Like, for example, the straw man fallacy. It's very persuasive to do that to somebody. It makes you look really powerful if you're arguing in front of an audience where they don't know what a straw man fallacy is. But obviously, if you're in a Socratic space and everybody knows what a straw man fallacy is, it doesn't make you look powerful anymore. It actually looks like you've made an egregious error. So in this class, we're going to consider it a Socratic space where the assumption is that the people who are engaging with you in the discussions are trying to engage in a Socratic dialogue with you, where we're all going to be on board with free inquiry, where everyone gets to have the view that they wish, as long as they're expressing it cleanly and using the methods that we've covered in Unit 1, and are willing to accept criticism of that position. And it's not so much that the criticism is directed at them as a person, but really it's a cooperative type of criticism, constructive disagreement, where the interlocutors that you have in this course are going to help you see maybe strengths and weaknesses of your view that you couldn't identify on your own, and that will allow you to build a better view. Okay, so in order to understand the Socratic space a little bit better, we're going to look more closely at Socratic dialogue. So for purposes of this video, the main things that I want to emphasize are the differences between formal debate, something called critical or intergroup dialogue, and Socratic dialogue. So one of the reasons to draw these distinctions is that I think these are some types of discussions that you're probably familiar with. They're common at the college level, and Socratic dialogue is probably the least common. And so what we want to do is try to understand what Socratic dialogue is by understanding what it's not. So trying to contrast and compare Socratic dialogue with these two other types of discourse that you might have seen before. So formal debate probably is pretty familiar to you. It's built into our political system. Lots of high schools have a debate team. In college, you could also be doing debate. If you're thinking about going into law, you're probably practicing this stuff left and right. Critical dialogue, if you're interested in critical theory, you may have already been in and maybe participating in courses where critical theory is the background methodology. You may have already participated in these kind of conversations. They involve disagreement and they involve contentious topics, just like the formal debate does, but you engage in a slightly different way for different goals. And each of these two things differ in important ways from Socratic dialogue, even though there are some commonalities as well. So our main goal is to understand Socratic dialogue just a little bit better by contrasting it with these other two types of discourse. All right, so debate. Debate is older than philosophy, really, and people have always been willing to argue and try to persuade other people to do what they want to do. But here we have a picture of Socrates, who was actually put on trial. And at the end of his life, in his 70s, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth and for impiety. And here you see him standing in front of fellow Athenians in the world's first democracy and arguing that they should not consider him guilty. So he was trying to persuade them to vote not guilty, and there were, some 500 something people in the audience here who got to take a vote on whether he should be found guilty or not. And originally, the vote was taken, and he was considered. He was ultimately found guilty. But then um, the next round of voting, after he gave this speech, there were more people who voted to put him to death than originally had voted him guilty of the crimes. So it was quite funny that the speech that he made trying to persuade them to find him not guilty actually made people very upset. So it's quite a fun discussion that you could go ahead and take a look at. It's called The Apology. Tons of resources online where you could go through and learn a little bit more about that. Something that you'd probably cover if you took history of philosophy, or an intro class that covers epistemology. Really fun stuff there. But basically, Socrates was known to go out into the marketplace. He was very good at rhetoric. He was very good at persuasion. So at the end of his life here, he didn't fail. He did this on purpose. He was trying to be a pest, and he was quite happy to be found guilty, and he drank poisoned hemlock of his own volition, even though he could have easily escaped the punishment after it was levied against him. He had interesting reasons for wanting to do that late in his life there. So he was very gifted in the art of sophistry, but he chose to limit his rhetorical skills by the pursuit of truth and logic. So that set him apart from the politicians and kind of like the old version of lawyers. They didn't technically have lawyers at that point, but they would argue just the way our modern politicians and lawyers would, where they're not really arguing about with the aim of showing something is true because they really believe it's true. It's just that they have this goal of making certain things happen in the world, and they have to persuade people to accept things. Then that's what their main goal is just move people's beliefs around, not so much work together to find truth. So Socrates was concerned that if people were working like that in politics, that the young democracy there in Athens, which was the first democracy in the world, wouldn't survive. He thought the people needed to be educated in identifying mistakes in reasoning and be kind of on board with thinking clearly and caring about how much evidence supported certain views, how much premises supported certain views in order to keep a democracy alive. So you may be sympathetic with that. But in any case, that is where we're seeing this divide already at the beginning of philosophy, where philosophy kind of takes a side step where it used to be just rhetoric and sophistry that ruled the day. Okay, so the Socratic tradition is still alive and well, but so is the rhetorical sophistic tradition. That is the one that still reigns in our political system and in our courtrooms. So it should be a familiar divide, even though it's also quite old. And if you go back to the session 1 materials on the rhetorical triangle, you'll remember that Aristotle was very aware that if you try to argue with people just using straight logic and using everything as extremely precise and accurate, you'll lose probably the argument, because people also care about ethos and pathos. So the claim here isn't that you cannot use ethos and pathos in arguing in a Socratic context, but those things have to be limited by logos. Okay, and so if you need a reminder on what the rhetorical triangle means here, just head back to session 1 and you can get a reminder. Okay, so formal debate. What's going on with formal debate? Well, the main thing is that debate is set up to have winners and losers. So in the case of presidential debate, we're looking to persuade voters to either vote one way or another. In a chamber debate, like here's a chamber debate at the Oxford Union. This is Kathleen Stock, a philosopher who works a bit in the philosophy of sex and gender, among other things like philosophy of fiction. She had a very famous debate, and what happens is the person who's presenting here, who's the invited guest, they have to give a speech, and then they kind of have to take all comers. So other people in the audience are allowed to come in and just ask questions, and the person in this position, so stock here, has to respond to whatever is asked by the responders that come. And in a more modern version of this, we also see that. So here's Charlie Kirk. You may have known about Charlie Kirk and his untimely death. Here he is in a very popular forum for debate right now, where it's a Jubilee debate, where what they do is they put people in a circle around somebody they've invited in to take all comers, very much like a chamber debate. They put on a timer, and people get to come in and challenge the guest, and in a debate style, right? So it's not really that they're trying to work together towards the truth. In each engagement, one person is trying to like one up the other person by catching them in a mistake or catching them in a contradiction. So they do have some interest in the truth, but really it's kind of a one-upsmanship kind of situation. Okay, so in the structure here, what we have are, there's going to be rules that are laid down, whether it's the Jubilee debate forum and the chamber forum. Rules for presidential debates are quite strict, and everyone has to obey the rules. They're typically timed, and the goal is to establish a clear winner or loser. And so, you know, if you're doing debate team, you know, you're going to end up with some neat awards like that, which is something you're not going to get in a philosophical discussion in a Socratic dialogue. So sorry about that. Okay, so I think everyone's pretty clear on what a debate is coming in. It's a very big part of our culture. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time thinking about the details of what makes a debate a debate. But I would just add that if you're interested in debate, there are some neat opportunities here on campus for you. There was just an event that was closed up that one of the philosophers here helped organize the local team. And not every debate style activity actually has a focus on competing directly or with another team in a back and forth real life, you know, kind of way. Ethics bowls are kind of fun because you work as a team and you give a presentation on a topic, and you don't have to directly defeat someone else or take a position you don't accept. You get a topic, you just try to give your best take on that topic and argue for a particular resolution, and then submit that. The other team does it as well, and then the judges kind of determine who's done the better job. So it's a bit different than a formal debate like you'd see in the Oxford Union style, but this is a really good one for philosophers because it's easier for you to kind of be patient, not trying to one-up the other team, but only do the best job you can at presenting the case that you want to make. All right, so the other thing to think about when we're thinking about debate is just to remember that even though a lot of debate ends up being kind of heated, it's really formal debate is not really about angrily asserting things like against the other team, and the people who are in the debate often they don't even believe what they're arguing, and it's actually one of the skills that you develop if you're in formal debate. You're often assigned a particular position that you have to argue for, and you have to argue for it even if it's not the view you hold, or even if it's a view that you think is false. You have to do your best to argue for that view. And sometimes you're put in a position where you have to actively argue against the view that you really accept in real life. And this kind of gives you a training in distancing yourself from claims and arguments and just thinking about those things in a detached way. And so if you're from a family where there's a lot of yelling about politics or something, it might seem like there's a debate going on there, but if it's just somebody yelling what their view is, and the other person is wrong, and they're just doing that back and forth, that doesn't have enough structure to really even be a debate. It's kind of just a fight, and that's something that I hope you'll want to avoid. Okay, so next topic that we want to contrast with Socratic dialogue is going to be critical intergroup dialogue. So this is a dialogue type that comes out of critical theory. The most standard form of it in universities is the Michigan model. We're not going to concern ourselves too much with the details, but we'll just get a sense of why it's different from debate and Socratic dialogue, even though it has a lot of the similar elements. Okay, so sometimes in this course I'm going to use critical with the 2 T's whenever it's like short for critical theory. This happens a lot as we move on with when we turn to critical theory work. They'll use things like critical thinking, but they don't really mean critical thinking in the Socratic sense with argumentation, that kind of thing. They have a different meaning. We'll take a look at that, but just to know that there's sometimes I'm going to have that critical with the 2 T's. I'll remind you of that, but that will be something that we're going to cover later. Okay, so if we have intergroup dialogue, we have different stages of discussion. So we have to be in a group, and really what we want to do at the beginning is get comfortable with each other. We're going to look for common ground. We're going to look for differences that might be interesting and worth exploring. And a lot of it is about just hearing people say what they think on the topic at hand, listening to them closely, trying to understand what they're saying, and then when you express yourself, trying to be honest and real to your life experience, and developing trust and a mutual understanding that way. And then once the trust is kind of established, you can move on to the stages where you're really probing differences in common ground with the people in the room. And in this stage, you can use things like storytelling and anecdotes. Those are great ways of explaining where you're coming from. We are going to be listening. You're really going to be pointing out like, oh, okay, your culture's different in that way, and then try to think about, well, how would that affect the way we engage with each other? Okay, and in this context, we're also going to be specifically looking at all these common ground points and differences through a critical theory lens, and that is going to usually mean that we're looking for differences in power and types of privilege amongst the people in the group. Okay, and then as you move on, you're going to maybe start thinking about how to resolve some of the conflicts that arise because of your differences, and difference in your perspectives on whatever contentious topic your group is discussing. And we want to, at this stage, we want to think about the disagreements, but we also want to focus on building common ground, building relationships, building empathy with people who have different identities, people who are coming in from different places on the power hierarchies, those kind of things. And then finally, once everyone has the opportunity to connect and build trust in these ways, the last step is kind of an action planning and collaboration. So the outcome here is to talk not just about where you've been and what you've been through, or who you are, and what differences and commonalities you see, but to build a sense of how that could be transformed into action. Okay, so some kind of political action. All right, so you might, if you're interested in critical theory, you might recognize that as praxis. Okay, so it's about ultimately, after you go through all these steps, you can see how it all kind of comes down to building an alliance of people from different backgrounds and experiences to make collaborative action in a political way for social justice, typically is how you'd express the goal there. Okay. So that is all we're going to really say about intergroup dialogue. It hopefully gives you a sense of what the goals are there. It's a strategy where you're allowed to use storytelling as kind of anecdotal evidence to explain yourself and to explain your perspective. This type of dialogue requires that you look through a certain type of lens, a critical theory lens, depending on what kind of position, like what kind of conversation you're having, what the topic is. The lens might be adjusted differently to accommodate the different identities that are involved. But the ultimate goal is to work together to come to common ground on what could help fix problems that you've identified as a group. Okay, so the final conversation here, is about Socratic dialogue. And so that's what we want to do in this course, in our Socratic space. And going back to the apology of Socrates, okay, what we have here is a little bit of a clip from the apology in which Socrates likens himself to a gadfly. So a little type of annoying fly that would bite at cattle and was really, really irritating, and everybody knew what a gadfly was. And so he says, look, I know that I'm annoying. I know that when I'm in the marketplace and somebody's trying to give a political speech to get you to vote for them, and I kind of pipe up and I point out that what they're saying doesn't make any sense, it's really annoying. It seems like I've always got something to complain about, no matter what you say. I'm in the marketplace arguing with you as a mom who's just trying to grab some food for dinner, as a child who just wants to play, and there I am asking you these probing questions. And he says, I understand that the way you experience me when I'm behaving that way is that you're irritated. You feel like I'm just like one of these annoying bugs. And he said, but sometimes you need that. Okay, I understand this, it's irritating, but in a way you guys are all napping. And napping in this sense is you're not reflecting on the views that you hold. Not enough, if you're going to be in a democracy anyway. You're not paying attention to what the politicians are saying. Not enough, anyway, if you're going to be in a democracy. Okay, so he basically said, just like your impulse might be to swat at a gadfly and kill it, you might have that knee-jerk reaction when you hear me engage with people in the marketplace. But would you rather sleep for the rest of your lives? Would you rather go through a life that you've never examined? Would you rather have people persuade you with bad arguments and using things like straw man fallacies and equivocation to just manipulate you into getting you to believe what they want you to believe? Or would you like to be awake in a way that allows you to see those kind of tricks and see through them and have an autonomous life? And so he's saying, I understand that you think I'm a gadfly. Maybe I am. But if I'm the gadfly of Athens, it's the kind of wake up that you need. That I'm this little bug that's gonna, yes, very gently. I'm not dangerous. I just am gonna keep you from falling asleep on your watch. Okay, so Socratic gadfly. Now that we have that concept, I think we can talk a little bit about Socratic dialogue as a way of having someone stake out a position, and then someone gets to be the gadfly. And when we start a Socratic dialogue, it's always the same way. Somebody thinks they know what's going on, and so they stake out that position. And then the people who are listening, they have the opportunity to listen very closely and make sure that they understand what the person is saying. That's the first step of the gadfly response. But in the third step, once you know what the other person is saying and that they believe that you have understood them correctly, then you go into that gadfly mode. And here, it's not about sharing your own views on the topic. You're not switching the subject to things that you believe or what you think people should pay attention to. As the gadfly, all you're doing is kind of like working your way around what the proponent has said, okay? And taking little stings, right, where there's been maybe something that was vague or ambiguous, or maybe the premise seems to be false, and you just kind of sting at little points in the proponent's position. And you never have to, in doing that, reveal your own views or what you would have said if you had been given the opportunity to kick off the dialogue. That's just not your job as the gadfly. The gadfly stays focused on what the proponent has said, because they're the ones who said they had it all figured out. The gadfly just tries to come in and go, well, did you really have it figured out? Is everything you said absolutely perfect? Is all the reasoning that you've done absolutely perfect? Is the evidence perfect, right? So the gadfly is focused entirely on the proponent. This is very different from debate, right? Where you take turns and you each try to argue, and yeah, you do a little bit of gadflying to the other side, but you also give your own positive view. That is not going to happen in a Socratic dialogue. When you take the turn as the gadfly, you set your own views aside, and you focus entirely on what's good and bad about the proponent's view, okay, that we started with. And then once you're done with that, the proponent gets a chance to use that feedback to make adjustments to their view. And sometimes it's like, oh man, yeah, I said that, but I shouldn't have said it that way. Or, oh, I didn't know that fact. Now that you said that, okay, well, I'll qualify what I said. I'll make it so it's not so broad. I'll be more careful this time. Or you might have equivocated, and the person who's playing the gadfly will point that out, and you're like, okay, well, if I can get my point across without equivocating, that would be better. So then you fix your language so that you don't do that, and you still get the conclusion that you wanted. But it's always a possibility, and in the ancient texts where we have Socratic dialogues happening between Socrates and his interlocutors, all the traditional dialogues written down by Socrates' student Plato, they all end in aporia. So that means basically that the conversation reaches an impasse where the people who are going back and forth, the proponent plus the gadfly, they continually find mistakes until it's kind of unclear what the response to the gadfly criticisms would even be. And so at that point, the dialogue often ends, and people just kind of say, well, we didn't figure out what the answer is, but the progress we made was in figuring out what the answer's not, and how, not to solve the problem. Okay, so it's okay to end with either fixing things in light of what the feedback from the gadfly gave you, or to just admit, look, I don't know how to fix that, and I'm going to have to think about this more before I go back to feeling confident that I even have a position that's worth sharing on this topic. Okay. Okay, and so one of the things that we're talking about here implicitly is the idea of epistemic humility. To engage in a Socratic dialogue, you have to have this epistemic humility to understand that there can be that you can have criticisms of your view, and it doesn't mean that it's a criticism of you as a person. What it means is that you're not perfect, and that the views that you have can be probably stated better at best, or maybe there's revisions that you have to make at worst, but to be open to that, to be humble about what you do and don't know. And one of the things Socrates was famous for is saying that of all the things that you might say about me, about whether I'm wise or not, I think the one thing that sets me apart from other people is that I very, very deeply understand how little it is that I really know. And in some cases, they translate him as saying that he knows nothing, right? He has a lot of beliefs, but he can't feel perfectly justified in any of them. And so he basically says, I really don't even know anything. And so again, if you take a history of philosophy course, you can kind of go into the details on why he said that. But for the modern person, kind of just kind of getting a sense of, look, you know very, very little. You barely even have a sense of how much you don't know. So if you're at college, it's very easy to look at the people you're going to college with and go okay, well, I know a lot about music, and that guy knows a lot about organic chemistry, but he doesn't know much about music, and I don't know anything about organic chemistry. You get a sense of how little you know. But then there's basically all this stuff that you don't even understand, the first thing about it. You can't even imagine what it is that you don't know, and that's more than the stuff you know and the stuff that you don't know put together. So just a way of saying, in this course, just try to develop this idea of this disposition to recognize that everybody is fallible. Nobody's got it all figured out. Try to be willing to, you can be confident, but as long as that confidence is kind of gauged or proportioned to the degree of evidence that you have for your position or how strong your argument is. And so one of the ways that you can improve your confidence is running your ideas through a Socratic dialogue with the great gadfly. If it survives that gadfly, then you know that it's a pretty good position. And if the gadfly gives you feedback, well, you can just use that to make your view even better and stronger. So epistemic humility doesn't mean that you don't get to have convictions. It doesn't mean that you don't have strong beliefs. But it means that you only have strong beliefs about things that you've really thoroughly thought through as best you can, and have kind of put a critical lens, like in the traditional Socratic critical lens, put that that lens on it, so you would know where the weaknesses and strengths are. Okay, so that leads us to our little discussion here of the Socratic dialogue in general. So Socratic dialogue can be broken down in a few steps, and the major steps are just somebody has to stake out a position and say, this is what I think is right. That can kick off a dialogue, or it can kick off a debate. And for this course, you're not going to be responding by saying, oh, I disagree with you, here's my view, what I think instead. Rather, when somebody says, here's my view, your response is going to be, all right, I think I'm paying attention well. I think I can be fair and represent what you're saying accurately. And I can ask good questions to make sure that I've got what you said right. And then I'll take a minute to think about it, right? Is the argument that you've just given me valid? Is everything you're saying true? Is there anything that I didn't understand because the way you're stating it is just like not clear? It's not possible to know exactly what you meant because the language was vague, or there's some kind of ambiguity. You might start looking for counterexamples by, think about thought experiments. So that's your next stage there. And then if you have an idea, like, okay, that was probably not perfect and what the proponent said, that's when you can move into the next stage and say, yeah, so here's some questions I have for you. I think what you said there is a bit vague. If we allow it to be vague, it's going to have these problems. Or if we allow it to be ambiguous, it's not going to be clear whether you're implying this outcome or this outcome. So you want to press people and explain why that criticism is important, why it's one worth making in the context that you're in. And then the gadfly, if you have a lot of time together, you can raise a lot of questions. In this course, you're going to have like a very small little response to each person's discussion. So you really just want to focus in on one or two really good criticisms and work them out in a way that the person who's hearing them is going to understand why you raised them and exactly what the criticism is. So it's not about just making as many objections as you can, very superficially, but really thinking about which objections are going to be most useful to the proponent to help them fix their view, okay? And, of course, that could be uncomfortable for a minute, just like getting, stung by the gadfly. But you think about it, and sometimes, it's not clear which way you should go. It might just hit you like, oh, right, like that was a mistake. I'll go back and fix that. And then you can proceed and develop a new view. And then if there's time, you can start the Socratic dialogue over again and try the new view out on your gadfly friend. If you don't have that light bulb moment, if they really kind of got you and you're like, man, I don't quite know how to fix that problem, that's okay. That's okay. You just end up in a very open-minded state where you're just like, well, I got to think about that a little bit more. It was a good set of objections, and then in that case, you thank your interlocutor because either they helped your gadfly interlocutor because either they just helped you fix a problem that you didn't know was there before, or they've helped you to adjust your confidence, right? So that you're not overconfident in what you believe. You're aware that there's probably some more research or more thinking that you need to do in order to have a strong view on the topic. Okay. So I think it's interesting to note that this kind of cycle is exactly what happens at the research level in academia. So not just in philosophy or the humanities, but also in the sciences. When you stand up in front of at a conference for whatever research you're doing, the proponent will give a talk, and then there will be a Q&A. And during the Q&A, other experts will raise their hand, and they don't just say, hey, that was beautiful, I loved it, it was amazing. They'll often throw a comment like that at the beginning, but it's usually kind of like disingenuous, honestly. But then they launch right into, and they're meant to, the most important criticism they can think of, okay? So they're playing little gadflies. So this conference room here, there'd be the proponent up at the front, and all the people in the audience are supposed to be little gadflies. And that's the awesome setup because you're getting the best feedback from the best minds all at once. very targeted towards making your view better, right? So that guy who's giving the talk will then take all that gadfly feedback. He'll write up his journal article even better and then get it published in a journal, right? And so even at the journal level, the blind review process, it kind of is all gadfly oriented. So, once you get good at this cycle, you'll see like this is the cycle of good reasoning, really no matter what field you're in. Okay. So just summing up here, there's a little bit of an image that you can kind of look at more closely as you have time to do that. But what I wanted to do in this topic again, in this video lesson again, was just kind of draw out some comparisons and contrasts between intergroup dialogue and formal debate so that you don't sort of slide into intergroup dialogue mode or formal debate mode in this course. We're going to try to stay in that Socratic space where everybody's engaging in Socratic dialogue. Okay, so our conversations aren't going to be about somebody winning or owning somebody else. That's not going to be part of the story here. We don't need to be adversarial in order to have conversations where we disagree with each other. That's one of the things that also, intergroup dialogue emphasizes. Just because we're disagreeing doesn't mean that we're disagreeable, doesn't mean we can't be friends or get along. And so we want to have cooperative disagreement in the context of Socratic dialogue. So you can be friendly and still be very pointed in your criticisms. You just have to make sure that your language reflects that you're staying on the point, and the point is, has to be made even though it's not comfortable. You can soften the language by being friendly without undermining the strength of your logical point. Okay. So in Socratic dialogue, one thing that people can find stressful is that we do kind of focus on finding truth through very clear language, rigorous reasoning, pointed questioning, and your personal experience is sometimes relevant, but for the most part, it's not going to be relevant to assessing whether an argument you're giving is valid or whether most of the claims in that argument are true. So in many cases, a lot of the things that are central to intergroup dialogue are not going to be relevant in the context of Socratic dialogue. And Socratic dialogue does not really aim to build empathy or focus on how to change the world, right? So as we'll see later in the course, there's a quote from Marx that addresses that Socratic dialogue is not aimed at social action. And what we want to do in Socratic dialogue is give arguments that can kind of stand independently of the person who gives them. We want to strengthen each other's arguments and ideas through cooperative disagreement. And the general search here is for knowledge. And we're succeeding in a Socratic dialogue if we're clarifying a problem, clarifying our views, eliminating false beliefs, gaining more justified true beliefs, and developing just generally good intellectual virtues like epistemic humility along the way. Okay, so the key thing for discussions that's probably going to be most relevant as a takeaway is that when you're asked to play the gadfly role in a Socratic dialogue, you have to take a turn, but you're not going to get to express your own view at that point. Your gadfly moment is when you're taking on the position of just a little gadfly who's going to say, I'm going to try to find the most important criticisms I can of the view that you've staked out. This is not about switching the conversation to what you said in when you were playing the proponent or what you would have said instead of this person. Rather, it's going to be using the skills that you've been developing and practicing from Unit 1 to try to find something that you can say, here's a problem with what you've done so far. Here's why it matters. Here's why it's a criticism worth taking seriously. And ideally, here's how I suggest you could fix it, right? So that's going to be what the gadfly does in a Socratic dialogue. It's not about winning or owning. It's about finding criticisms that are worth making to help the person you're talking to develop a better view. All right. All right. So that's what it's going to be for this course. Hopefully that gives you a better sense of what a Socratic space is, and I hope that everyone listening is going to take on that challenge of becoming a person who can participate in Socratic dialogue in a Socratic space. And just along the way, just remember, if you're inclined to think, well, you know, I'm going to go into debate mode, don't do it. If you're inclined to go into IGD dialogue mode, don't do it. You know, just back off and just kind of remember all the things we've covered in Unit 1, apply those, and try to stick to the point at hand. I guess other than that, we are going to move into the gender and sex topic next. So in our next video, we'll talk about the transition into the other parts of the other units of the course, and I will look forward to meeting you all at the oral exams next week. Thank you very much.